Who in the audience knew Lou Bernal? Hey. To begin, we respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Otham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. But today we are celebrating the opening of Luis Carlos Bernal Retrospectiva. After tonight's presentation and remarks, I invite you to be one of the very first to see this much anticipated exhibition and enjoy a reception in the lobby until 9 p.m. But first, I must acknowledge the support and hard work that has made this endeavor possible. I share my heartfelt thanks to the entire staff of the Center for Creative Photography. This project has been years in the making, and today marks the wonderful fruits of everyone's labor, a labor of love to celebrate Lou Bernal. I'm sure you will agree when you see the exhibition tonight that this team has realized something truly wonderful. Please join me in thanking the staff. In 2022, the Center formed an advisory group specifically to help shape how this exhibition might reach audiences beyond campus. Through their collaboration with the Center's team, we have created a small traveling exhibition, a mini retrospective, the Retrospectiva, that will travel across the region to locations significant to Bernal's career. Its first stop is the Douglas Public Library, where it is now, in the city where Bernal was born. Please join Douglas. Please join me in thanking the people that I thought I would have a slide for. Everybody who's on the Community Advisory Council, many of whom are here with us tonight. The advisory group has also advised on the development of a slate of related programs in the community throughout the run of the exhibition. These programs are generously supported by Bank of America as the corporate sponsor. So now I invite Victor Varela from Bank of America to the podium for a few words.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Victor Varela. I'm a Vice President and Consumer Banking Market Leader for Tucson. Me and my wife are very excited to be with all of you here today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Todd Tabutis, that we know and understand that he's a great dancer, right? And his team here at the Center for Creative Photography for putting together such a tremendous event to celebrate the opening of the Luis Carlos Bernal Retrospectiva. On behalf of our entire Bank of America family here in Tucson, we're pleased to partner with the center to bring this exhibit to our community through sobremesas, artists, scholar conversations, and pop-up art experiences. First of which being hosted in my hometown of Douglas, Arizona. So I'm also Douglas native. And we'll be actually taking the trip tomorrow to see the exhibit over in Douglas tomorrow. At Bank of America, we believe that the arts strengthen human connections and contribute to greater cultural understanding. The arts uplift our communities by providing space for diverse expression. And in turn, the arts have a positive impact on the lives of our neighbors, our clients, and our associates. Our Bank of America Arts program supports a wide range of local and global nonprofit institutions as they help us explore the creativity, complexity, and collaborative spirit of the world around us. This exhibit is an opportunity to recognize and appreciate our Chicano and Latino communities with the many contributions they provide to Tucson and our country. From our culture to music, values and cuisine that have shaped our business and our society. And that's why we're proud to support the community programming for the Luis Carlos Bernal Retrospectiva in partnership with the Center of Creative Photography. This work will expand the exhibit beyond the location of the Center for Creative Photography and provide opportunities to engage a broader audience in meaningful ways, ensuring that arts and communities thrive together. As we get ready to enter the Hispanic Heritage Month, We're excited these community programs will engage people while bringing understanding and building mutual respect and celebration of diverse cultural traditions, making an impact which cannot be understated. Thank you again for giving me and Bank of America the opportunity to be part of this amazing event. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, Bank of America. In 2021, the Henry Luce Foundation awarded the center a major grant to support the exhibition, the Traveling Retrospectiva, and a full-color bilingual companion volume, the CCP co-published with Aperture, available tonight for purchase. The grant was absolutely essential to our efforts, and while representatives could not be with us in person tonight, I thank the Luce Foundation, especially Terry Carbone, Program Officer for American Art, for their generous support. And now, allow me to welcome to the podium Andy Schultz, Vice President of the Arts and Dean of the College of Fine Arts at the University of Arizona, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Todd, and good evening to all of you. I'm delighted to be joining you in celebrating the opening of this landmark exhibition. Todd offered a round of thank yous to some of the many people involved in realizing this extraordinary project. I'd like to add to that list Todd himself for his sensitive and deft leadership in stewarding this project in its final stages over the past year. Carrying forward a project begun by others has its own particular challenges, which Todd has handled with his customary grace and good cheer. So thank you very much, Todd. I also want to recognize that from its inception in 2021, the Bernal exhibition, catalog, and related programming have taken shape under the leadership of two previous directors. First director, Anne Breckenridge-Barrett, who in 2021 and 2022 led the project, and then interim director, Stacy Santa, in 2022 until Todd's arrival in 2023. I think Stacy's here, but I'm not sure if Annie is, but thanks to both of you for all of your work on this project. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to say that in my view, the Bernal project really represents CCP at its best. First, the mining and activation of an archive of an artist closely identified with Tucson and our region, whose work has national and global resonance that's only now being recognized. Second, the deep and thoughtful engagement, which Todd alluded to, with campus and regional audiences through the efforts of CCP staff and the generosity of the volunteer community advisory group. Third, the significant and enduring scholarship and the scholarly contributions made by the bilingual catalog co-published by CCP and Aperture. And finally, the dissemination of Bernal's artistic achievement through plans to tour the exhibition nationally in the coming years. So to all involved, from CCP staff to members of the Bernal family and countless others, you have my heartfelt gratitude. Thank you very much. And now it's really my truly great pleasure to introduce the curator of the exhibition and the primary author of the catalog that accompanies it, Elizabeth Ferrer. You know, in retrospect, it's difficult, if not really impossible, to imagine anyone else having partnered with CCP to take on this project. Elizabeth is really, by any measure, the leading authority on Latinx and Chicano photography working today. Her many publications and exhibitions over the past 30 years have been essential, not only in defining the field, but also in elevating the profiles of individual artists. For the sake of brevity, I'll single out just one achievement. Her book, which I've seen people carrying around today, entitled Latinx Photography in the United States, A Visual History, which was published in 2020 by the University of Washington Press. In this landmark publication, Elizabeth sets out to correct what she describes as, quote, the basic fact that by and large, Latinx photographers are excluded from the documented record of American photography. She succeeds in fundamentally correcting this disciplinary blind spot in really remarkable ways. The book has been called an essential resource, a foundational survey, and a remarkable feat. If you have not already become familiar with it, I urge you to buy a copy and place it on your shelf right next to your copy, which I hope you also buy, of the Luis Carlos Bernal Monographia, which you can have Elizabeth sign actually after this talk. So what a great opportunity. I can't help but conclude on a personal note by sharing with you something that is not on Elizabeth's CV, but which had an indelible impact on my own career, which is the fact that Elizabeth was my boss in the late 1980s when I was a graduate student in art history at Columbia University, working at the university's Wallach Art Gallery, of which Elizabeth was the director. As I think back to that time, which I'm somewhat bashful to admit is 35 years ago, I remember on the one hand, Elizabeth's exacting nature, her attention to detail, and her rigorous approach to everything we did in the gallery. By the same token, I remember her deep empathy for works of art and for the complex individuals who make them. As I recently had the great pleasure of reading Elizabeth's insightful lead essay in the catalog accompanying the exhibition, I saw these characteristics in full force as she traced the evolution of Lou Bernal's life and art with equal measures of rigor and empathy. You're in for a special treat tonight as Elizabeth shares with you her insights into the art and life of Lou Bernal. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Ferrer.
Well, first of all, thank you, Andy, so much. That was a wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here. This is a very special night for me and for the center and really for the whole kind of legacy of Chicano culture in the Southwest. I just also want to add a few thanks. First of all, to Katrina and Lisa Bernal, who once I started working on this project, helped me so much. You were so generous with your time and information and all sorts of, old family photographs and information and just making sure we got everything right. So I want to thank you very much for just, being with me through the whole process. Here at the Center for Creative Photography, the whole staff has just been incredible. The level of professionalism here is amazing. But I do really want to single out Becky Senf, Chief Curator, who, invited me to take on this project and trusted me with all this material, and I could not have had a better partner. And then finally, very, very specially, Armando Cristeto, who literally just arrived from Mexico. Here he is. Armando, you'll hear about in the lecture. He was Luis Carlos Bernal's great friend. They spent a lot of time together in Mexico, but also here in Tucson. Armando equally was incredibly helpful with endless numbers of emails, attachments where he would scan entire catalogs and magazine articles for me, numerous photographs, remembrances, information. He's just a kind of a walking Luis Carlos Bernal museum. And so this project would not have been possible without all of his help. So with that, let me actually begin let's give everybody a round of applause. And let me begin. So I actually began this project almost a quarter century ago when I was spending a lot of time in Mexico, and I was really focusing on exhibitions of Mexican photography. I never knew Luis Carlos Bernal, but I did know some of the people who were closest to him, including Armando, who I just mentioned to you, and Marietta Bernstorff, who once lived in Tucson and who was Lou's companion in his later years. I was actually visiting with Marietta in Oaxaca. I think it was about 2001 when she floated the idea to me of possibly curating a show of Luis Carlos Bernal's work. And, we talked about it, and there were some conversations as well as in-depth interviews with both Armando and with Marietta. The project never came to fruition, but I kept those notes, and I was able to find those notes 20 years later when Becky invited me to curate this exhibition. And I was able to report to her that, not only had I already begun the research decades earlier, but I knew these people. And as time came on, I realized I knew many other people who also knew Lou. And I tell you this because Bernal himself put a lot of stock in the uncanny and premonitions and the universal and the spiritual in the most universal sense. And, likewise, while I was working on this exhibition, I often felt the presence of a kind of guiding hand. Information would just kind of fall into my lap just when I needed it. And so many people were just so generous with insights, remembrances, old photographs. And I just felt throughout the entire process over almost 4 years of working on this project that there was just such good energy, such enthusiasm, such a willingness to share, that I'd like to think that we are portraying Luis Carlos Bernal just as he wanted to have been remembered. So let me begin with a brief biography. Luis Carlos Bernal was born in 1941 in Douglas, Arizona. And he had a modest upbringing. His mother was a maid, and his father was a boilermaker who worked for the local mining industry. The family later moved to Phoenix, where they enjoyed a somewhat more comfortable existence. And when he was 9 years old, he received a Brownie camera as a gift from a relative. And that was pretty fateful because he quickly became infatuated with cameras and with the whole process of making pictures. I think by the age of 11, he had already set up a darkroom in the family bathroom. At that time, a camera really could not have represented a career path for a Mexican American. Those were very, very different times. There was still, a lot of overt racism among two Mexican Americans. But he persisted. He persisted with his education. He persisted with photography, and he eventually acquired better cameras. He became a high school photographer for athletics, and he continued with it in college. He considered for a time becoming a Spanish teacher. But photography, I think we can all agree, it was a good decision. Photography won out. And it became his lifelong passion and avocation. So, here we see Bernal a bit older, at home with his mother at Andina, and then during his military service. After receiving his BA from Arizona State University in 1966, he was quickly drafted into the Army. And luckily, he was sent to Berlin because this was during the time of the Vietnam War, but he avoided conflict. And also, fortunately, he was assigned to work with photography for the Army. So he received more experience there, as you can see in this picture. While he was away, and I was able to read some passages from his journal, he was kind of very anxious to get back to Tucson, kind of back to life. He had already begun to think that not only was he going to become a photographer, but he wanted to use photography as an artist, as a form of personal expression, not as a documentarian, not as a commercial photographer. So he was discharged from the military in 1968. He returned to Arizona. He enrolled in ASU to get his MFA. And, he was really then on his path. And so that takes us to the late 60s and early 70s. And this is a really interesting period in the history of American photography, when photographers are really beginning to kind of break away from these long-held norms for what was then called, straight photography or purist photography, where one would just kind of photograph very directly, something that you saw in front of you. This was an era of a lot of experimentation, stage photography, darkroom manipulation. And this was something that Bernal himself was very interested in. He tried out a lot of these new approaches to photography. And he also spent some time working under Frederick Sommer, who's a very well-known photographer who was then based in Arizona. He made a series of abstractions like you see on the left, these kind of ingenious creations made out of lengths of arranged cut paper that closely follow Sommer's technique. And he also made photo montages that he invested with political or social messages, often working with images appropriated from the media. While Bernal pursued this kind of work for a few years, and you're going to see more in the exhibition, I think it's really illuminating to see how he began. He found his true voice as an artist after receiving his MFA. That year, 1972, by then he was married with 2 small daughters. He moved to Tucson to launch the photography department at Pima Community College. And in these same years, he was becoming increasingly conscious of his identity as a Chicano. He had always been proud of his Mexican-American identity. His parents instilled that value into him and made sure that he spoke Spanish very well. But something new was happening in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Chicano civil rights movement. begun with the struggle by farm workers in Central California and also in Arizona. This was a movement that attracted a lot of young people who wanted to work with Cesar Chavez and who volunteered. Luis was also interested in this, but he kind of took a different path. There were some photographers who were working with the movement. They were documenting protest marches and rallies. And also at the same time, these young men and women began to refer to themselves as Chicanos, a term that was once used as an ethnic slur, but reclaimed and redefined as an empowering term of solidarity and determination. And this movement soon crossed into the cultural sphere. So there was a flourishing in the arts, in mural making, in music and literature. And while Bernal might not have been quite conscious at the time, when he came to Tucson and started photographing in the barrios, he became a pioneering exponent in the field of photography in terms of expressing this newfound pride, the sense of Chicanismo. And that's why we call him the father of Chicano photography. So while Bernal was, while the movement was a true catalyst for Bernal, he didn't follow these other young photographers who were doing this more overtly political work and photographing demonstrations. Rather, he saw the possibility of using the photographic medium, I would say in more exalted terms, as a means of expressing Chicanismo in spiritual and cultural terms. So I want to read a few words by Bernal himself that he wrote about the time that he came to Tucson. He says, "I also began a spiritual move back to the barrio and a new attitude towards life, Chicanismo. Mexican-American is the term used to describe a person of American birth, but whose cultural soul derives from Mexico. This dual reality has been a burden which has clouded our identity. Chicanismo allows us to accept our history, but also gives us a new reality to deal with the present and with the future. To be a Chicano means to be involved in controlling your life. Chicanismo represents a new sense of pride, a new attitude, and a new awareness. The Chicano artist cannot isolate himself from the community, but finds himself in the midst of people, creating art of and for the people." So in the 1970s, say like around 1973, he's really reaching towards a new kind of Chicano aesthetic. Rather than using the camera directly in service to the movement, his concern is for individuals and for communities. He aimed to give visibility to those with little agency by focusing not on the many, but on the few, allowing him to draw out the specificities of individuals and the spirit of the people that he encountered. And I think that this was a side to his work that's, quietly political on his own personal terms. And in fact, when Luis Carlos Bernal peered into the lives of Mexican-American people, I think that he drew from the same desire for social justice that marks the work of more overtly political photographers. Now, his approach on the face of things was quite simple: to simply portray everyday people in their own comfortable environments and to memorialize those who were largely otherwise invisible. He made his initial forays into the Tucson barrios around 1973, when he would engage folks in conversation and simply ask, "Could I photograph inside your home?" We're talking now a half century ago, when these neighborhoods were populated by families who could trace their lineage in Southern Arizona over generations. But they were beginning to feel the pressure of redevelopment and gentrification. This was displacing longtime residents. So again, by locating his work within these neighborhoods with these people, I'd say that there's really a quiet political dimension to this. He's representing people who, his representation of these people, are symbols of photos that represent a claim to space and active belonging. Bernal's goal was to speak as an insider, as the first Mexican-American photographer representing his own people. He was able to create such intimate depictions because he was so familiar with these kinds of environments and the ways of life they represented. He respected these people. They could have been family members. Bernal was gregarious, as I mentioned. He spoke Spanish, and he found that folks would easily invite them into their homes, even into their bedrooms, as you'll see in many of the photographs. And once he arrived into these environments, he learned to work quickly. He was a photographer of economy who didn't make a lot of photographs in a single space. He learned to photograph in tight domestic settings and with whatever lighting was familiar. By the mid-1970s, Bernal had defined a style that melded documentation with portraiture and still life, as well as with elements of stage photography. I think that his move away from the experimental approaches of the early 70s was really a big decision for someone who deeply wanted to be seen as an artist. But at the same time, I think that he recognized that only by hewing close to more direct forms of representation could he most fully realize his goal of making art rooted in the realities of common people. He saw his artistic mission as a moral imperative to speak for his community and to act as a bridge to uphold Mexican Americans to the larger world. To realize his artistic ideals, Bernal understood the need to bring his whole self to the creation of an image. From his childhood memories of racism and poverty, to his education and his thorough training with the camera, and his personal and his political values. Before making a single photo, he would spend a lot of time in preparation, walking, talking, thinking. Sometimes he would walk around all day and not take a single photo. But when he clicked the shutter of the camera, he had fully readied himself artistically, emotionally, and intellectually for this act of crystallizing an encounter and of magnifying the life of another human being. So that brings me to the Benitez Suite, which is an early emblematic series of work for Bernal. This group of 7 photographs, which you'll see in the exhibition, represents a kind of inflection point for the artist because it signals his arrival at another form of portraiture, views of interior space absent people. And it was in 1977, during one of his walks with his camera in Tucson, in one of the barrios, that he came across this small house, front door slightly ajar. He knocked a couple times, no answer, and so he entered, and he discovered quickly that this was an abandoned residence. He wrote about this, he says that objects covered every surface, and everything was covered with a layer of dust. The house had belonged to an elderly woman who had gone to live in a nursing home, Mary Benitez, and this is someone who he later managed to meet and who gave him permission to use these photographs. And Bernal wrote, there were only 3 rooms to the entire house, but it was filled with a treasure of visual and spiritual imagery that glowed in the quiescent light transmitted by the curtains covering the windows. I moved cautiously since I felt that I was trespassing in the spiritual space of another human being. For me, the most poignant series in the image is of Mary Benitez's bedroom, saturated with soft light streaming in from the window. Calendario, as it is called, refers to the calendar hanging from the bedroom's doorway. And that calendar dates to 1951, and it's illustrated with the face of Jesus Christ. So this is a reminder of the temporal and the spiritual that Mary Benitez would have beheld every day for a quarter century. And what we know about Mary Benitez is, really what we see in these 7 photographs, that she was poor, that she lived in a world of memory, and that she was deeply religious. So as I mentioned in the exhibition, you'll see the entire suite of photographs, and as well as a couple of contact sheets. So you actually see the process of Bernal moving around the rooms and making these photographs. There's also this rare video of Bernal talking inside the house about discoveries, so make sure that you take a look at that. One thing that was just so fascinating to me is this is a photograph named Ahora. We discovered all of these notes in the archive, and we began to decipher them and read them. The reason that the photograph is called Ahora, because every note, whether it's a grocery list, a reminder for a doctor's visit, and more than anything, prayers, it all begins with the word ahora, or now. So these individual notes that Bernal assembled very carefully into this photograph act as kind of a register of this woman's life. And what you'll also see in the exhibition is the actual notes that we've assembled the best that we can, into this image. And I think it gives you another really interesting insight into Bernal's process. And what that process was memorializing the lives of everyday people, people who would have passed into obscurity. And I think it's just so poignant and emotional the way that he was able to do this for Mary Benitez. So not long after Bernal completed the Benitez Suite, the photographer Maury Cami invited him to take part in this major project, Espejo, Reflections of the Mexican American. This would be Bernal's largest project to date. It was a big exhibition of several photographers that was going to travel nationally, as well as a publication. Bernal also received a grant, something like $7,000, to fund the creation of a new body of work, which he called huge at the time. He was the only Chicano to take part, which I think is so interesting. And it's not so much a reflection on the sponsors, but on the fact that there just were so few, if any, other Chicano photographers who would have been up to this task. But Bernal really took this assignment on, because he was the only Chicano with a great sense of responsibility. In speaking about his status as the only Chicano involved with Espejo, he wrote, "I am a perfectionist, constantly driven by the need to create a more perfect image, to excel in a world where I do not have the luxury of being average. I have felt a great deal of frustration and anger in my life, and I have used photography as an outlet for these frustrations." So with the money that he received, Bernal was able to travel beyond Tucson to other parts of Arizona, as well as to throughout the Southwest. And his goal was to narrate this broader picture of Mexican-American life. And significantly, as you can see, with those funds, it allowed him to work in color. And color became a hallmark of Bernal's practice. That's something that's now so commonplace, and the great majority of artistic photographers today are, making these very large images, digital images in color. But in the early 1970s, that was really rare. Black and white was just the standard. And there was this kind of elitism around black and white. If you worked with color, that was a little kitschy. That was the province of commercial photography. And color film and printing were also expensive. And Bernal was always a little strapped for cash. So this was a bold move at the time. And I think it just shows also, in the way that, he's making these works that are not, these wild experimental type works. He's also he's somebody who is experimenting. He's taking chances. He's trying new things. So working with color this early on really makes him a pioneer of color artistic photography, even though he's really never been acknowledged or, seen in that small group that we're also working in color. He discussed his earlier black and white barrio photos as environmental portraits. But beginning with Espejo, he aimed to explore image making in new ways. It allowed him to go deeper, to lay bare the spirituality, the interiority of his subjects. And as you can see, simply to more vividly describe their world. This is El Gato, which he photographed in a small town in New Mexico near the border. And he captures what for me is just this perfect composition, a young man standing languorously in the heat of the midday sun. And he's seemingly unaware of the visual pun that Bernal devised by posing him in front of the mural. And also, one of Bernal's best-known images emerged from the commission, and that's this photo, Dos Mujeres, or Two Women, from 1978. This is really Bernal's kind of coming-of-age image. Here we see this young girl, Marisela Martinez. She's age 12, in the foreground. And I think she represents kind of this, innocence, but at the cusp of womanhood. And then the older woman in the background is Patricia Lopez. She's visible through the doorway, and she sits beside the window so that the light kind of illuminates beautifully the side of her face. Each figure seems to be in their own world, but they're united by their lack of reserve. They present themselves openly, without pretense, simply as they are. Bernal might not have known these women. That was very common. He photographed people that he had not known previously. But by the time he was immersed in Espejo, he had become just incredibly gifted at setting people at ease and creating these kinds of, really nuanced, sophisticated compositions. And I believe that Bernal really relished the ability to work in color. Part of the mastery of Dos Mujeres was the way that he used the color of the two different rooms to establish the identity and the space for each woman. In this portrait of Albert and Lynn Morales, which was made in a bar in Silver City, New Mexico, it is only with color that he could evoke the gaudy setting. And again, we see Bernal's gift for composition. Here, the two figures create this tightly enclosed world, their arms and hands arranged in the shape of a heart, and they're framed by these lines of neon. Some of Bernal's photos just seem so much more casual. They kind of give us the appearance of family snapshots, but he's always very intentional about who and how he photographs. So for example, in this photograph, Barrio Portrait, which he made in his hometown of Douglas, We see the three children posing in front of their home with their parents at the entrance. The father is beside the doorway, and their mom is seen just inside, standing shyly. Now, this composition is not accidental. He worked with his subjects. One critic called it, he worked with them in collaborative acquiescence. So he's kind of lightly directing, telling people where to stand. Sometimes when he's inside, he's opening a curtain, closing a door, having somebody sit on a sofa, photographing a group and then only photographing a single person. So there is this staged aspect to this work that makes it much more than a snapshot, more than a documentary practice. Bernal also recognized signs of change in the barrios. As you saw with many of the earlier photos that I showed you, he frequently portrayed elders and their traditional, if fading ways of life. He was very conscious of the fact that he was in Tucson during a time when there was a lot of redevelopment and modernity and the passing of an older generation. But he wanted to capture this change, these signs of modernity, the lives of younger people. So we see this in Los Vatos Locos, which is a scene of young men hanging out around a car, or in the portrait of Ana Quiñones, whose bedroom wall is like a snapshot of popular culture of the late 1970s. So following the Espejo project and into the 1980s, Bernal was becoming better known, and he was traveling internationally. He was especially to Cuba and to Mexico. He was taking part in major exhibitions. He was speaking at conferences, teaching workshops. And he was also developing friendships with other Chicano and Latin American artists. These relationships became a really crucial support system for Bernal. For all the success that he was having a very active career. He was not being invited to have like a major solo museum exhibition. He was not, actively showing his work or selling his work in photo galleries. And he saw his white colleagues having this kind of success. And, it kind of rankled him because he knew he was good. But these opportunities were just not open to him at the time. But when he traveled to Mexico and was invited to take part in the most important conferences attended by photographers from throughout Latin America, or when he went to LA and met with other Chicanos and got to know really well-known Chicano artists, he was among equals and he felt validated and supported. Here, what we see are, some of his most important friendships with Luis Jimenez, the sculptor who was based in New Mexico, and with Ricardo Valverde, a fellow photographer who was based in LA. Tragically, like Bernal, both died at a relatively young age. Travel also allowed Bernal to expand the scope of his work. In a 1980 trip to San Diego, he made this iconic photo in Barrio Logan of these young men standing beneath a bridge overpass, flanked by murals painted on the bridge's pylons. This is, for me, one of Bernal's really politically charged statements, because this area around the highway had been designated as a park in 1971 after years of pressure by local activists who protested the destruction of a lot of their neighborhood for the creation of the highway. And Chicano Park, as it was called, soon became a kind of outdoor museum of these large murals. And I think that Bernal's portrait of the men, one who displays his gang affiliations with his hand symbols, suggests both the defiance of mainstream cultural norms and this territorial claim to land and to the art that surrounds them. And he again travels to the West Coast in 1984. Interestingly, he's invited to be one of 10 photographers commissioned to photograph at the LA Olympics. This was a really high-profile assignment for Bernal, and he would join photographers from around the world who came to the city to cover the event. But as his friend, the writer Leslie Marmon Silko, wrote it, Lou soon found the elitism inside the Olympic pavilions obnoxious, so he chose to photograph outside the Olympic gates. He decided he would approach the project from the perspective of a Chicano, focusing on the gate attendants, security staff, and souvenir vendors. In other words, the working class people who made the enterprise run and who were largely left out of the picture. While he was in LA, Bernal also spent time in the places where Mexican Americans congregated, and he wanted to illustrate a side of life in the city that was less celebrated. So he just, he went around the city, with his camera, returning with black and white film, as he often did when he traveled. And he just depicts, the vitality of street life, food counters, people attending to everyday tasks. And so I think it's just so fascinating to have this like truly Chicano image of what the time was like in LA during the time of the Olympics. Mexico City and Havana were also very important to Bernal because, as I mentioned, he took part in these major conferences and exhibitions. And he saw these conferences as extremely important because he came to Mexico City or to Havana again as a Chicano. And he wanted to act as a bridge to introduce Chicano culture and his work as a Chicano to these international audiences. And he also found that he had great affinity with Mexican photographers. In Mexico City, he met the great photographer Manuel Alvarez Bravo. He met Lola Alvarez Bravo, whose archive is also here at CCP. He met Graciela Iturbide, who was then a young photographer and who photographed him. You'll see her photograph of him in the exhibition. And also what I find interesting is that this younger generation, they were really struck by Bernal's color photographs. That was something that was just really rare in Mexico, where, you know, photographers just didn't have the budget or the access to these kinds of materials. So ultimately, Bernal became influential to a younger generation of Mexican photographers. And so he certainly was this bridge, you know, interacting between these worlds. Travel, I think, especially in Mexico and in Havana, it really brought out a different side to Bernal's creative work. He'd occasionally make the kinds of photos that he made in the Southwest, you know, these individuals in interior settings. But he also fell under the influence of kind of the Mexican style of street photography, you know, in those days, which was focused on portraying indigenous people and the urban poor. When he traveled, even though he was working with color in the Southwest, he limited himself to black and white film and to working with his Leica with a 35mm camera so he could work more quickly. And this is one of my favorite photos that he made in city, La Pelona from 1980, capturing a man who has this kind of bemused smirk as he stands at the entrance of a coffin store. You know, for me, this work is a little bit of an homage to a figure like Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who also photographed kind of these everyday scenes as emblematic of these kind of, you know, philosophical ideas or larger realities. Armando Cristeto, who was often at Bernal's side when he traveled in Mexico, told me how struck Lou could be by the poverty that he found in Mexico. And he captured images like these, Cristo de la Calle, where he imagines a blind beggar as a Christ of the streets, a figure enduring his own Calvary. From the time that Bernal discovered Mary Benitez's abandoned home, he was also attracted to the kinds of objects and images that everyday people live with. He repeatedly discovered walls and tabletops covered in arrangements of holy pictures, family photos, figurines, kitsch, santos, posters, pictures of John Kennedy. And he began to turn his lens on these inanimate objects. And he was creating this kind of new kind of portraiture, you know, one absent people. Many, like this view of a woman's bedroom, attest to the profound role that Catholicism played among the people that Bernal photographed. I think that such spaces must have felt both familiar and mystical to Bernal. He was raised a Catholic, but he wasn't a practicing Catholic. He did not subscribe to the same level of faith, but he surely understood what these kinds of home altars meant. So here's a couple more in this vein. Santos y Televisión, which was made in Mexico in 1981. And The Bedroom of Blas y Pauline Flores, made in 1978. Bernal's also interested in people's secular lives and the way they reflect the secular in their homes, and how these kinds of, like, you know, posters and again, images of John Kennedy, how they reflect kind of the concerns of Mexican people, Mexican-American people at that time. There's often these photos that reflect these clashes, right? So the sacred and the profane. We see presidents and saints, Disney characters in The Last Supper. And he's really simply showing us how people lived. He doesn't romanticize, you know, he doesn't look at this world through a haze of nostalgia. He's really showing us how life is changing, and he's showing the influence of the outside world of, you know, and of the media. And I'm showing you this photo again of Nanita Mendibles, where you see this Disney balloon and The Last Supper, and, you know, and the Virgin Mary all in the same picture. I think that the photograph itself is another common element in Bernal's interior scenes, making many of his photographs function as pictures of pictures. Frequently, we see walls hung with portraits of ancestors, known only through hand-colored photographs, and these proud displays of graduations, weddings, military portraits. These images acted as recuerdos, preserving the memory of extended families over time and space, and reflecting really the real centrality of photography to Mexican-American families, long before the age of social media or, camera phones. Bernal made his last major series in 1987 and 1988 in Lubbock, Texas, thanks to a grant that he received from Texas Tech University to portray the town's Mexican-American population. North Texas was just unfamiliar territory to him. He didn't have a lot of time to make the work, but I think that he made some of his most distinct and penetrating images in Lubbock. Here, for example, we see the adolescent Angelina who sits on the bed as she waits for Bernal to click the shutter of his camera. Although she had just met the photographer, he had clearly allayed any discomfort she might have had in meeting him, apparent in the way she directly confronts the camera's gaze. And he also photographs outdoors, again, returning to the theme of the family, to picture this group in the front of their house. And you'll see these photographs in the show. They're relatively large scale, and you really see how he's just completely in command of color by the late 1980s. While in Lubbock, he had heard about this curandera, a healer named Caridad Sanchez, and he really wanted to photograph this woman, but his superstitious nature made it one of the most fraught encounters of his career. So she also has this home altar, as you can see, and it's populated by the usual array of Catholic saints that Bernal is familiar with, but also by the bust of an American Indian, a large black doll, and a statue of Saint Martin de Porres, the patron saint of mixed-race people, who was known for levitation and miraculous cures. This syncretic mix of Christian, African, and Caribbean, this is something very new to Bernal. And while he was with her, Sanchez told Bernal that he would change many lives. As much as he was intrigued by her, he felt this peculiar energy in the room, so he just took a few photos and then he left. This encounter with the curandera was one of several psychologically charged incidents that occurred in the last few months prior to the accident in October 1989 that eventually claimed his life. His friends have told me that he seemed restless during his very last visit to Mexico that year. They noted that the past and the future were very much on his mind. He spoke about moving away from photography. He thought maybe he would move to Oaxaca for a period, maybe to take up writing. He always liked to write. He was also frustrated. He was frustrated by the status of photography and compared to other art forms. And he was frustrated by the level of success he had received in his own career. While visiting the Mayan site of Palenque, he tripped into this kind of open tomb structure, and he jokingly blamed the incident on this shirt that he was wearing. It was covered by calaveras, but it rattled him. And upon returning to Tucson, he wrote to his dear friend, Armando Cristeto, and he wrote, and you'll see this, the notice here, he writes, "I am glad that we had time para rematar nuestra amistad, to complete our friendship." Less than a month later, he was hit by an automobile while riding his bike to school one morning. He fell into a long coma from which he never awoke, and he died on August 18, 1993, his 52nd birthday. For Luis Carlos Bernal, the practice of photography involved an act of finely balancing concerns for technique, aesthetics, culture, and community. In speaking of his portrayals of Mexican Americans, he once stated, "I've tried to capture the spiritual and the religious aspect, photographing an ordinary situation and making it more than ordinary, because it is more than ordinary. There is a sense of greatness, of immortality to every one of us here, and that attaches us to the larger events in life." While others might have seen these people as people who were lesser or unremarkable, Luis Carlos Bernal found beauty in a quiet grandeur. In a career spanning barely 2 decades, he produced a body of work that constitutes a Chicano imaginary, a worldview absent discrimination and marginalization. Bernal mapped a borderless realm across the Southwest into Mexico, picturing a world where Mexican Americans were at the very center of attention, indelibly memorialized. His photography might not have been at the cutting edge, but it went deep to the core of Chicanismo, expressing an enduring pride and depth of spirit. Thank you all very, very much.
Hi, my name is Becky Senf, and I work here as Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography. I'm just going to briefly contribute my thanks to the good energy we've been feeling tonight, and then we'll invite Lisa and Katrina to say a few words. I want to begin by thanking Elizabeth Ferrer. You can see what a brilliant woman she is. Maybe another round of applause for Elizabeth. She has been the perfect collaborator on this project. She is patient, she is generous, and she is truly brilliant. I want to thank the staff whose dedication to Luis Carlos Bernal's legacy has truly been an inspiration. So thank you to my colleagues at the CCP. I want to thank the Bernal Community Advisory Group, whose enthusiastic participation and valuable input has been so great. The members of the Community Advisory Group are David Andres, Jacqueline Jean Barrios, Ceci Garcia, Dan Hernandez, Anita Uizar Hernandez, Adriana Kong Romero, and Jake Sullivan. So thanks very much to the Community Advisory Group. I want to thank Bernal's friends and colleagues who have been such a great support and have been so generous throughout this process. I want to thank Lisa Bernal Breathauer and Katrina Ann Bernal for your trust in the CCP. It really means very much to us, and we're so proud to be able to bring this exhibition to new audiences. And then finally, I want to thank the audience. You all individually are each part of bringing Bernal's story to its rightful place. I hope that you'll talk about the exhibition, and I hope you'll invite your friends and your family to learn about Bernal. With that, I'd like to invite Lisa and Katrina to offer their thoughts.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Bernal Breathauer.
I'm Katrina Bernal.
And it's a little emotional. It's really wonderful to see this presentation and this lecture done by Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you got it right on. Thank you for all your research and for all your work putting together the book and the show. We really appreciate it. It's amazing to see our fathers be recognized and start to come to the forefront of the world of photography. And it's nice to see Mexican Americans and our culture coming forward and being represented in a positive way. So,
Yes. Absolutely. And we just want to thank everybody that's been supportive of this project, especially the community. Ever since even our dad's accident, there's been just so much support from CCP and from the community, and we're just thrilled that you guys are here tonight and that we can see such a fabulous showing of people, and also that the exhibition is just beautiful. It's been curated just so well. Thanks to Elizabeth and the CCP staff. It took a lot to get here, and we're just so thrilled this is the right time, and it's obvious when you guys will see the show. And we hope you come back and do bring other people, because we know that this one visit tonight is probably not enough to really take all of it in, because it's a lot and it's beautiful. So.
and I just want to share one more thought. Todd had people raise their hands early on to say, how many of you knew Lou Bernal? Can you guys raise your hands one more time? I'm putting you on the spot. I want everybody to look around at these people. If you didn't know Lou, there's a lot of young people here who've never met him. please seek out these people tonight. There's family members, there's friends, there's colleagues. They have some amazing stories. And this is how we keep Lou's legacy alive, is by talking about him and sharing those stories. And he was a good storyteller. So you might find and hear some really funny stories if you ask the right people. So we invite you to do that tonight. Thank you.
All right, with that, we'd like to invite you to see the exhibition and join the reception. There is a bar on the patio. You have a timed ticket that you were given that will tell you what time you can enter the exhibition. And Elizabeth and I will be signing books out on the patio. So if you'd like to bring your book out, we'd be happy to sign it. Thanks very much.